Hello everyone, this is Christopher Fernandez and I'm a part of the team EFTT. I'm just discussing my double top and bottom trading signal that I made. So the double top and bottom signal, the way it works is that it usually forms like an M. This is the document that I had created, and it usually either forms an M or a W, and that's formed by having a high extremum and another high extremum, and then in between a low extremum. Usually it'll form this kind of very distinct M or W shape, and then sometimes it'll also do a kind of not distinct shape where you see the two uh, low extremums, but you don't really see the high extremum here. It just kind of flattens out. Uh, so that can be times where it's kind of difficult to detect the shape or the pattern that you're trying to detect. But generally, it's this kind of shape is very common. So much more so than like Head and Shoulders. So it's a pretty common indicator and trading signal to make. All right, so going over to the code. So I guess I'll start off with zigzag. So the zigzag, so when I first made this trading signal, it was kind of messy and everything was kind of mixed together in a couple different files. But I ended up seeing Justin's code, and I realized that I should just split everything up to make it nice and neat and organized. So I did. So the zigzag, the trends, and the pattern and header files are pretty much identical to the typical files that you would see. I found a trading signal sample online, and these were also included in it, as well as Justin, so he probably got it from a similar source. Uh, from what I've researched so far, these are pretty much uh, generic for most head and shoulders and double top and bottom indicators because they have very similar shapes. The double top and bottom indicators are very zigzaggy, just like the head and shoulders, so they use the same zigzag file, which is what you use to help you find the highs and lows to detect the exact pattern. And it's pretty normal. You create the shape, you calculate it out, make sure it's actually a difference and not just like little bumps here and there like we saw in the strange W, the second picture on the document page. And yeah, and you can add extremums to the thing, and you can find the extremums by time, which would be based on the time from launch up, like the start of the expert advisor running up till now, and then just regular extremums, which are by distance. Moving on to trends. So the trends file is the one that determines whether the group of extremums fits together, whether there's enough of externals and enough section to actually make the pattern, to actually determine whether there's a trend happening or if it's not enough. So like if we have one little zigzag and then it goes on for an hour, we know that that's probably not going to be a proper M or W shape. It's not a double top or bottom, it's just a random little bounce in the trend. So this helps us to determine that. Yeah, usually it all relies on the zigzag to determine whether or not it's a proper high and lows and stuff like that, and then on another calculate function. And moving on to pattern. So this pattern is kind of a generic pattern file. I ended up using it for my main pattern file, the double top and bottom pattern. It inherits from this class. So this class is very basic. It has the typical extremums for the starting trend, the ending trend, and the corrections, and the min and max corrections. And this class is pretty much what I found online. It didn't really require much changing. Most of the what you change is when you override it here in the DTB pattern. I'm gonna go ahead and skip to that one since these three are just pretty generic. So the DTB pattern ends up using the inheriting from the pattern class. It's kind of similar to the format that Justin used because his was really neat, and there's not much of a difference in how you check for each pattern. The biggest difference is that the middle extreme that Justin is searching for his head and shoulders is a high and mine is a low. So that's pretty much the same. The end extremum is still a high, so that doesn't change much. So here's where we override all of the functions from pattern. So we have the create to create the actual pattern. We have search to actually look through the pattern, and the search actually checks to make sure that there's enough extremums to actually form the pattern. So in double top and bottom, you need at least 3 extremums, either 2 highs and 1 low, or 1 low or 2 lows and 1 high. Excuse me. And the check signal isn't really used as much anymore. Now we have the wizard, because the wizard is the one that majorly deals with buying and selling. So the check signal down here. So this was the search. This is where it checks through to make sure we have enough extremums for the actual whole process. And scrolling down, check signal. So check signal is where it would check through everything. It checks to make sure that some stuff is initialized, and then it continues on downward into going through the for loop to determine when we should sell, when we should buy, etc., based on the how high and low the trends are, and whether or not we're on an upturn or a downturn, basically going up or going down in value. But since the wizard now is the one that in MQL5 mainly takes care of all the buying and selling, the check signal class really isn't as useful. I wasn't really sure if I should cut it out. I kind of just want to leave it for now since it doesn't really negatively impact the program at all. But if we end up determining that it's just not really needed, I might just remove it from the program. All right, and then all of these. Well, I should talk about header too. So the header class is where the extremums and some of the major objects that we're going to be using are initialized, or at least they're defined here. So we have the extremum, the 2 extremums that we're going to be looking at here. They're both structs, and we have a clear. We also bring in, this is where we include all of the zigzag trends and the pattern, because we ended up needing to make some objects for them. This is the array objects, which is going to hold a bunch of objects of an array of the objects of different highs and lows and extremes that we're going to be looking at. Trade, the pattern itself that we're going to be looking at, and then the start search for when we're actually looking for the pattern, so that we can determine whether we're going to do the trade, whether or not we're going to do the trade. And then lastly is the signal class. So the signal class holds basically everything. This is the main part of the program. So normally if we're building this as just a regular expert advisor, everything would be going into the onTick and the inits functions in that expert advisor, but we ended up translating it over into our signal class so that we can create trading signals from this and create, well, this is a trading signal. We can create expert advisors from this trading signal. So everything goes through this. We have all of our definitions for the different variables that we're going to be using, the period, shift, method, and applied. So the time frames and stuff that we're going to be using, the different patterns. This one I kept the same as Justin's because I liked the simplicity of it. It's just we didn't find a pattern. No pattern is successful. We're going to go short, which means that we're going to sell, and go long, which means that we're going to buy. And then those two are determined in our short and long conditions. So here's where we define the functions for the constructor and destructor. Some more functions for determining the period, shift, method, and applied, which is just getting the values. They're just getters. the validation settings, the long and short conditions, um, the initialization. So these are the initialization functions for the indicators. Then when we go down here, this is where we define a lot of the values for the different functions, or the different variables that we're going to be using. I ended up going with just these numbers, low numbers, for testing purposes, but I could put anything there I would want to. Use the destructor. Here's the validation settings, which just double checks to make sure the period is valid. Um, we have our initialized DTB, which is just to make sure that all the indicators are, all of the pointers are correct and they're not having issues. Because if one of the pointers is invalid, then we don't want to continue going through because it'll just cause a crash. So we want to make sure that the init fails before we actually get to the main part of the program. This is just the init indicators that gets called by the expert advisor. So we have our long and short condition, which are pretty much identical. The only difference is what pattern we're going to be using, whether we're going to buy or sell, and that'll tell the wizard, whether or not we want to buy or sell, depending on which pattern I give it. So in the long condition, here's just an example. It goes through, it gets the array of objects, and it'll continue to add to the array of objects and delete from them, but based on what we're using and what we go through. We do the start search, which is at the time, whatever time frame we're using at the moment. And then we have our while loop with where all of the checks and compares in the pattern go to determine whether or not we're going to buy and sell, and then we return the result all the way at the end. And short condition is basically identical. I'm running out of time. Let me go down. Okay, and then here's where we have check pattern, which is where it actually goes through and checks the pattern, checks to determine whether or not it's a normal pattern, which would be an M, so double top and bottom, or a W, which was just a reverse double top and bottom. And then that depending on which one we find will determine how we handle it, because obviously if it's reversed, we want to take it a different way. And that's basically it for double top and bottom. Thank you for listening. I apologize if the audio is a little bit unclear. I don't have a microphone on my computer, so I had to use my phone to record this. I hope there's no problems with it, and thank you very much for listening. This is Chris Fernandez. Have a great day. Bye.